This will be a continuation of Emanuel Swedenborg's Conjugial Love, Chapter 1, titled The Joys of Heaven. After this, the angel returned to the house of assembly of the wise from the Christian world, and called those to him who had deluded themselves with the belief that the joys of heaven and eternal happiness were paradisal delights. To these he said, "Follow me, and I will introduce you into paradise, your heaven, that you may enter upon the blessedness of your eternal happiness." Then, through a lofty gateway formed by the interlacing boughs and branches of noble trees, he introduced them into a paradisal garden, and there led them around through winding paths from place to place. It was actually a paradise at the first entrance of heaven, into which those are admitted who, in the world, had believed that the whole of heaven is a single paradise because it is so called, and had impressed on themselves the idea that after death there is complete rest from all labour, that this rest is nothing else than breathing in the very soul of delights, walking upon roses, being gladdened with the most delicate juices of grapes, and celebrating festive banquets, and that this life is found only in the heavenly paradise. Led by the angel, they beheld a vast multitude of old and young men, and of boys, also of women and girls, some sitting upon beds of roses, in groups of 3s and 10s, making garlands, with which to adorn the heads of the old men and the arms of the young, and bouquets for the breasts of the boys, others plucking fruit from the trees and carrying it in osier baskets to their companions, others pressing into cups and genially quaffing the juices of grapes, cherries, and berries, others drawing into their nostrils the fragrant odours exhaled and diffused from flowers and fruits and fragrant leaves, others singing melodious songs with which they softly charmed the listeners' ears, others sitting by fountains and diverting the waters of the gushing stream into various forms, others walking about, playing together and throwing off witticisms, others running, playing, and dancing, here in groups and there in circles, others entering into little summer houses to repose on couches, not to mention many other paradisal enjoyments. When they had seen all this, the angel led his companions hither and thither through winding ways, and finally to some spirits sitting in a most beautiful rose garden surrounded by olive, orange, and citron trees, with swaying bodies and with their cheeks in their hands. They were wailing and weeping. Addressing them, the companion of the angel said, "Why sit ye thus?" They answered, "It is now the 7th day since we came into this paradise. When we entered, our minds seemed as though elevated into heaven, and admitted to the inmost enjoyment of its joys. But after 3 days this happiness began to grow dull, and to be diminished in our minds, and become imperceptible, and so to become null. And when our imaginary joys thus ended, we feared the loss of all the delight of our life, and became doubtful about eternal happiness, doubting even whether there is any eternal happiness. When we wandered through paths and open places, seeking the gate by which we had entered, we wandered round and round in circle after circle, and inquired the way of those we met, some of whom said, 'The gate cannot be found, because this paradisal garden is so spacious a labyrinth that whoever wishes to go out enters more deeply in, so there is nothing else for you to do than stay here forever. You are in the midst of it, where all delights are in their very centre.' They said further to the angel's companions, 'Here now have we sat for a day and a half, and being without hope of finding the way out, we have lain down on this bed of roses. We see around us an abundance of olives, grapes, oranges, and citrons, but the more we look at them, the more is our sight wearied with seeing, our smell with smelling, and our taste with tasting. This is the cause of the sadness in which you see us, and of our wailing and weeping.' Hearing this, the angel of the company said to them, 'This paradisal labyrinth is truly an entrance into heaven. I know the way out, and will lead you.' At these words the sitters rose up and embraced the angel. Then together with his group they accompanied him. On the way the angel taught them what heavenly joy is, and hence eternal happiness, but they are not external paradisal delights, unless, together with these, they are also internal paradisal delights. External paradisal delights are merely delights of the senses of the body, but internal paradisal delights are delights of the affections of the soul. Unless these latter are present in the former, there is no heavenly life in them, because no soul, and without its corresponding soul, every delight gradually grows feeble and torpid, and wearies the animus more than labour. In the heavens there are paradisal gardens everywhere, and angels derive joy from them, this joy being a joy to them so far as the delight of the soul is within it. Hearing this, they all inquired, "What is delight of the soul, and whence is it?" The angel replied, "Delight of the soul is from love and wisdom from the Lord, and since love is effective, being effective by means of wisdom, therefore the seat of both is in the effect, and the effect is use. This delight flows from the Lord into the soul, and descends through the higher and lower degrees of the mind into all the senses of the body, and there comes to fullness. Hence joy becomes joy, and becomes eternal from the eternal from whom it is. You have seen things paradisal, and I assure you that there is not a single thing therein, not so much as a little leaf, which is not from the marriage of love and wisdom in use. Therefore, if a man is in this marriage, he is in a heavenly paradise, and so in heaven." After this, the angel guide returned to the house of assembly to those who had firmly persuaded themselves that heavenly joy and eternal happiness consist in a perpetual glorification of God, and a festive continuing to eternity, being persuaded of this because in the world they had believed that they were then to see God, and because from the worship of God the life of heaven is called a perpetual Sabbath. To these the angel said, "Follow me, and I will introduce you into your joys." He then introduced them into a small city, in the midst of which was a temple, and all the houses of which were called sacred buildings. In the city they saw a great concourse of people flocking in from every corner of the surrounding country, and among them were a number of priests. These received the newcomers, and after saluting them, took them by the hand and led them to the temple gate, and from there into some of the buildings round about the temple. There they initiated them into the perpetual worship of God, saying, "This city is an entrance court to heaven, and the city's temple is the entrance to a magnificent and most spacious temple which is in heaven. There God is glorified by the angels with prayers and praises to eternity. The regulations, both here and there, are that newcomers shall first enter the temple and abide there 3 days and 3 nights. After this initiation they are to go to the houses of the city, which are so many buildings consecrated by us, and from building to building, and in communion with those assembled therein, are to pray, cry out, and recite sermons. Take great care that within yourself you think of nothing, and with your companions speak of nothing but what is holy, pious, and religious." The angel then introduced his company into the temple. It was filled and crowded with many who in the world had been in great dignity, and also with many of the common people. At its doors guards were stationed, lest anyone go out before he had stayed there 3 days. And the angel said, "Today is the 2nd day since those here present came in. Observe them, and you will see the glorification of God." On observation they saw many of them sleeping, and those who were awake perpetually yawning, some from the continual uplifting of their thoughts to God, and no return thereof into the body. They saw as faces shut off from their bodies, for so did they seem to themselves, and thus to others also. Some they saw with delirium in their eyes, arising from perpetual abstraction. In a word, they saw them oppressed in breast and weary in spirit from disgust, all turning away from the pulpit and crying out, "Our ears are stunned, put an end to your preaching." Not a word is any longer listened to, and the very sound begins to be loathsome. And then rising up, they rushed in a body to the doors, and, breaking them open, pressed upon the guards, and drove them away. Seeing this, the priests followed, and pressed close to them, teaching, beseeching, sighing, and saying, Celebrate the festival, glorify God, sanctify yourselves. In this entrance court of heaven we will initiate you into the eternal glorification of God in a magnificent and spacious temple which is in heaven, and so into the enjoyment of eternal happiness. But these entreaties were not understood by them, and were hardly heard on account of the dullness caused by their 2 days' suspension of mental activity and their detention from their domestic and forensic affairs. When they struggled to tear themselves away from the priests, the latter seized them by their arms, and also by their garments, urging them to the sacred buildings where they were to preach, but in vain. Let us alone, they cried, we feel as though our body were in a swoon. At these words, lo, 4 men appeared in bright white raiment, and wearing mitres. In the world, one of them had been an archbishop, and the other 3 bishops. They had now become angels. They called the priests together, and addressing them said, We saw you from heaven with these sheep, and saw how you feed them. You feed them even to insanity. You do not know what is meant by the glorification of God. It means bringing forth the fruits of love, that is, doing the work of one's employment faithfully, sincerely, and diligently, this being the effect of love to God and of love to the neighbour. Moreover, it is the bond of society and its good. It is by this that God is glorified, and then by worship at set times. Have you not read these words of the Lord? Herein is my Father glorified, that ye bear much fruit, and ye shall become my disciples. John 15:8. You priests can be in the glorification of worship, because this is your office, and from it you have honour, glory, and recompense. But even you could not be in that glorification any more than they, were it not that honour, glory, and recompense are connected with your office. Having thus spoken, the bishops commanded the keepers of the gate to let all in and out freely, for there are multitudes who, in their ignorance concerning the state of heaven, can think of no other heavenly joy than perpetual worship of God. After this, the angel and the companies returned to the places of assembly, from which the companies of the wise had not yet departed. There he called to him those who believed that heavenly joy and eternal happiness are merely admission into heaven, and admission by divine grace, and that they will then have joy as do those in the world who on festive days enter the palaces of kings, or by invitation go to a wedding. To these the angel said, Remain here a while, I will sound the trumpet, and hither will come men famed for wisdom in the spiritual things of the church. After some time there came 9 men, each decked with laurel as a mark of his renown. The angel introduced them into the house of assembly wherein all were present who had been called earlier. In their presence the angel addressed the laureled 9 and said, I know that, by your wish and in accordance with your idea, it has been granted you to ascend into heaven, and that you have returned into this lower or sub-heavenly earth with full knowledge of the state of heaven. Tell us, therefore, how heaven appeared to you. They answered in turn. The first said, From early boyhood to the end of my life in the world, my idea of heaven had been that it was a place of all blessedness, happiness, enjoyment, pleasantness, and pleasure, and that if I should be admitted there, I would be surrounded with an aura of felicities, and would breathe them in with full breaths. Like a bridegroom when he celebrates his nuptials and enters the bridal chamber with his bride. With this idea I ascended into heaven and passed the first guards and also the second, but when I came to the third, the officer of the guard addressed me and said, Friend, who are you? I answered, Is not this heaven? From the longing of my desire I have ascended hither. Pray, let me in. He then let me in, and I saw angels in white raiment. They walked around me, and after examining me murmured, Lo, a new guest not clad in the garments of heaven. Hearing this, I thought, This seems to me like the case of the man of whom the Lord said that he had come to the wedding without a wedding garment. So I said, Give me such a garment, and they laughed. Then one came running from the court with the command, "Strip him naked, cast him out, and throw his garments after him." And so I was cast out. The second in order said, "I believed as he did, that if only I could be let into heaven, which is above my head, joys would flow around me, and I would be animated by them to eternity." And I too obtained my wish. But on seeing me, the angels fled, and said among themselves, "What is this monster? How came this bird of night hither?" And actually had the feeling of being changed from a man into a bird of night, although I was not changed, a feeling which came upon me from drawing in the heavenly atmosphere. But presently one came running from the court with the command that 2 servants should lead me out and take me back to my home by the way up which I had come. And when I was at home, I appeared to others and to myself as a man. The third said, "My constant idea of heaven was derived from place and not from love. Therefore, when I came into this world, I longed for heaven with a great longing, and seeing those who were ascending, I followed them and was admitted, though no farther than a few steps. But when, by reason of my idea of the joys and beatitudes there, I wanted to gladden my animus, then, owing to the light of heaven, which was white as snow, and the essence of which is said to be wisdom, a stupor invaded my mind, and hence darkness my eyes, and I began to rave, and soon, owing to the heat of heaven, which corresponded to the brightness of that light, and the essence of which is said to be love, my heart palpitated, anxiety took possession of me, and tormented with inward pain, I threw myself flat on the ground. Then, as I lay prostrate, attendants from the court came with the command to carry me gently away into my own light and heat, and when I came into these, my spirit and my heart returned to me. The fourth said that he also had been in the idea of a place respecting heaven, and not in an idea of love. When I first came into the spiritual world, he said, I asked the wise whether one would be permitted to ascend into heaven. They told me that it was permitted everyone, but that men should take heed lest they be cast down. At this I laughed, and I ascended, believing, as do others, that all in the whole world are capable of receiving the joys of heaven in their fullness. But in truth, as soon as I was in, I almost lost my breath, and from pain and consequent torment in my head and body, I threw myself on the ground, and, writhing like a serpent before a fire, crawled to a precipice and threw myself over it. Afterwards I was picked up by some bystanders below and carried to an inn, where sanity returned to me. The five others also gave amazing accounts of their ascent into heaven, comparing the changes of the states of their life to the state of fishes when lifted out of water into the air, and to that of birds in the ether. They said that after these severe experiences they no longer had any desire for heaven, but only for a life in companionship with their like, wherever they were. And they added, We now know that in the world of spirits where we are, all are first prepared, the good for heaven and the evil for hell, and when prepared they see ways open for them to societies of their like, with whom they will dwell forever. They then enter these ways with delight, because they are the ways of their love. Upon hearing these accounts, all who were first summoned confessed that they too had had no other idea of heaven than as of a place where with open mouth they would drink in to all eternity the joys which surrounded them. After this the angel of the trumpet said to them, You now see that the joys of heaven and eternal happiness are not the joys of a place, but of the state of a man's life, and that the state of heavenly life is from love and wisdom, and because the containment of these two is use, the state of heavenly life is from their conjunction and use. It is the same thing if it is said charity, faith, and good works, for charity is love, faith is truth, from whence is wisdom, and good works are uses. Moreover, in our spiritual world there is a place just as in the natural world, otherwise there would be no habitations and separate abodes. But here, place is not place, but an appearance of place, according to the state of love and wisdom, or charity and faith. Everyone who becomes an angel carries his heaven within him, because he carries within him the love of his heaven. For by creation man is at least effigy, image and type of the great heaven, the human form being nothing else. Therefore every man comes into that society of heaven, of which he is the form and individual effigy, and when he enters that society, he enters into a form corresponding to himself. Thus he enters into that self-form as of himself, and from that form, as it were, into the same form in himself, breathing its life as his own, and his own as its. Each society is as one common whole, and the angels there are as the similar parts from which this common whole coexists. From this it now follows that they who are in evils and thence in falses have formed within themselves an effigy of hell, and in heaven this effigy is in torment by reason of the influx of opposite into opposite, and of the violence resulting from their activity. For infernal love is opposed to heavenly love, and therefore the delights of the two loves clash with each other as enemies, and when they come together they destroy each other. When these recitals were concluded, a voice was heard from heaven saying to the angel of the trumpet, "Choose 10 out of all those who were called together, and introduce them to us. We have heard from the Lord that he will prepare them so that for 3 days the heat and light, or love and wisdom, of our heaven will do them no harm." 10 were then chosen, and these followed the angel. By a steep path they ascended a certain hill, and from this the mountain upon which was the heaven of those angels. At a distance this heaven had previously been seen by them as an expanse among the clouds. The gates were opened for them, and when they had passed the 3rd gate, the angel guide hastened to the prince of that society or heaven, and announced their coming. The prince then responded, "Take some of my attendants, and inform them that their coming is acceptable to me. Then, after bringing them into my outer court, and assigning to each his room with its bedchamber, take some of my courtiers to minister to them, and some of my servants to serve them at their pleasure." And this was done. When they were brought in by the angel, they asked whether they would be allowed to go and see the prince. And the angel answered, "It is not allowed before noon, and it is now morning. Until noon all are engaged in their offices and employments, but you are invited to dinner, and then you will sit at table with our prince. Meanwhile I will conduct you into his palace, where you will see things magnificent and splendid." Being led to the palace, they first viewed it from without. It was large, built of porphyry, and with a substructure of jasper, and in front of the entrance were 6 lofty columns of lapis lazuli. The roof was of plates of gold, and lofty windows were of transparent crystal, and their frames were also of gold. After this they were introduced into the palace, and conducted from room to room. There they saw ornaments of ineffable beauty, and on the ceilings decorations of inimitable carving. Along the walls were placed silver tables inwrought with gold, and on them various utensils of precious stones, and of entire gems in heavenly forms, besides many other things which no earthly eye has seen, for which reason no one could bring themselves to believe such things exist in heaven. When they were standing in amazement at the sight of this magnificence, the angel said, "Marvel not, the things which you see were not made and fashioned by any angelic hand, but were formed by the Maker of the universe, and presented to our prince as a gift. Here therefore is the art of architecture in its very art, and from it are all the rules of that art in the world." He then added, "You may suppose that such things enchant our eyes, and so infatuate them that we believe them to be the joys of our heaven, but because our hearts are not in them, they are only accessory to the joys of our hearts. So far, therefore, as we look upon them as accessory and as the work of God, so far we behold in them the divine omnipotence and clemency." After this the angel said to them, "It is not yet noon, come with me into the garden of our prince, which is close by the palace." They went, and at the entrance he said, "Behold the most magnificent of all the gardens in this heavenly society. But they replied, "What are you saying? There is no garden here. We see only a single tree, and among its branches and on its top, fruits as though of gold, and leaves as though of silver, with the edges adorned with emeralds, and under the tree little children with their nurses." At this the angel said with inspired voice, "This tree is in the centre of the garden, and is called by us the tree of our heaven, and by some the tree of life. But go farther in, draw near, and your eyes will be opened, and you will see the garden." They did so, and their eyes being opened, they saw trees entwined with the tendrils of vines and laden with delicious fruits, and the tree tops with their fruit were bending toward the tree of life in the centre. These trees were planted in an unbroken line which ran out and was extended into ever new circles or gyres after the manner of a perpetual helix. It was a perfect arboreal helix wherein different species of trees followed each other in unbroken order according to the nobility of their fruits. The beginning of this great gyre was at a considerable distance from the tree in the centre, and the intervening space glittered with a stream of light from which the trees of the gyre shone with a splendour which was successive and continuous from the first trees to the last. The first trees, luxuriant with the choicest fruits, were the most excellent of all. They were called paradisal trees, and are never seen in any country of the natural world, because they do not and cannot exist there. Next came trees of oil, after these trees of wine, then trees of fragrance, and lastly trees of wood useful for working. Here and there in this arboreal helix or gyre were seats, the backs of which were formed by the converging and intertwining of branches of trees, and were enriched and adorned by their fruits. In this perpetual circle of trees were gates which opened into flower gardens, laid out in plots and beds, and from these into lawns. Seeing these things, the companions of the angel exclaimed, "Lo, heaven in form! Whithersoever we turn the sight of our eyes, some heavenly paradisal thing flows in, which is ineffable." Rejoiced at hearing this, the angel said, "All the gardens in our heaven are representative forms or types of heavenly beatitudes in their origins, and it is because an influx of these states of blessedness uplifted your mind that you exclaimed, 'Lo, heaven in form!' Those who do not receive that influx view these paradisal things merely as forest. All who are in the love of the uses receives the influx, but those do not receive it who are in the love of glory and not of use." For their instruction he then explained what the several things in that garden represented and signified. When they were thus engaged, a message came from the prince, inviting them to eat bread with him. At the same time 2 court attendants brought garments of fine linen, saying, "Put these on, for no one is admitted to the prince's table unless arrayed in the garments of heaven." They then made themselves ready, and accompanying their angel, were led into an uncovered portico, an ambulatory of the palace, where they awaited the prince. There the angel presented them to dignitaries and magistrates who were waiting for the prince. And lo, after a short time the doors were opened, and they saw him enter, in the order and pomp of procession, through a door in the west, which was wider than the others. Before him went the privy and councillors, then councillors from the chambers, and after them the chief men of the court, midway among whom was the prince himself. Then came courtiers of various ranks, and lastly guards, numbering in all 120 persons. The angels standing in front of the 10 newcomers, who from their apparel seemed like natives of the place, approached the prince and reverently presented them, and the prince, without stopping the procession, said to them, "Come, dine with me." They then followed him into the dining hall, and saw a magnificently spread table. In its centre was a high pyramid of gold, and on the forms of this pyramid in 3 rows were 100 small dishes containing sweet cakes, jellied wine, and other delicacies made of cake and wine. Through the centre of the pyramid rushed a leaping fountain of wine, like nectar, the stream of which was diverted from the top of the pyramid and filled the cups. On either side of this lofty pyramid were various heavenly forms in gold, on which were dishes and plates filled with food of every kind. The heavenly forms which held the dishes and plates were forms of art from wisdom, such as in the world no art can produce, nor words describe. The dishes and plates were of silver, engraved around their edges with designs like those on their supporting forms. The cups were of pellucid gems. Such was the furniture of the table. Look for my next video where this chapter will be continued.